So right here, folks, I'd like to try something a little bit different for once and change the kind of the flavor of my channel just a bit. Because as you know, these true crime cases are very, very serious. They involve a lot, and there's a lot that goes on, you know, and they tend to move fairly fast sometimes. So you don't have always as much time to be able to truly digest everything. And so what I like to do here, and I'll see if you guys kind of enjoy it because I'd like to have your feedback on this. What I'd like to do here is do something that similar true crime shows have done from time to time, and it's called a kind of a psychological deep dive. And it's where I will personally go through the mannerisms and the attitude and the beliefs of a particular individual to see what I can assess and really discern about them from my time in going through the analysis. And there's not any kind of crime talk. There's no pictures or moving instruments. It would just be me essentially speaking directly to you guys, which is good because it provides me kind of a change of pace as well to really begin to feel into some of these deeper threads. And so one of the first cases that I'd like to officially go ahead and move ahead with analyzing is I would really like to analyze the psychology, state of mind, and purpose of none other than Brian Laundrie. That's correct. And really, if it wasn't for Laundrie in certain ways, you know, my channel would not exist in the same way that it does. And ultimately, long term, it would not have the same level of just degrees of content and success and similar things that it does. Some of the psychological things about Mr. Laundrie are something that I greatly would enjoy exploring just a bit. And so I'm going to do kind of a short exposition of probably about 12 minutes where I will talk about his personal psychology, and in the background I'll be thinking of questions, and I'll really be pondering also what might the psychological profile look like of someone like Tony Klein, which could be, for example, the next case study. So thank you guys, look forward to this coming up next. So as I said, this is going to be an interesting kind of thought experiment because this is about analyzing someone, and I'm going to give some of my official feelings and thoughts on the situation of this individual. And in this case, I have chosen the subject to be Brian Laundrie, ironically enough. And the first thing I will say is that it's interesting when you ponder somebody like Mr. Brian Laundrie. I feel there's a lot of things about him in particular that people just don't understand, and rightfully so. I sense there's a great deal of complication inside Brian Laundrie in the way that he's very reserved, has kind of grandiose, narcissistic tendencies in more severe ways than people would normally encounter. I noticed something interesting about him at a certain time when I came across his path. He was very boisterous, very into bragging or braggart for some reason, desiring to, for no particular reason, brag about certain things that he had done or how he might be able to get something from a bank, similar things like that. And I've always found that a little perplexing about Brian Laundrie in specific. And I know it's hard for some people to digest this because, in a way, Brian Laundrie was certainly a psychopath. That's very true. But I want to understand to a certain extent why that is. You know, I want to be able to see behind the mask for a moment here and really ponder why Brian Laundrie did certain things that he did. I mean, it's almost like I could ask him and he could say, you know, yeah, but I didn't really want to do that. And I'd be like, but you hurt all those people, and numerous people were killed by you, Brian. So what are you getting at? You know, and he'd be like, you know, I had to do something. The world was against me, but the world was not against you, Brian Laundrie. That's the problem. The way that I see it when I diagnose the parapsychology or the personality style of someone like Brian Laundrie. They always automatically assume the world is against them. This is kind of a naive way of viewing the world. This is just my opinion, so take it with a grain of salt. But it is how I kind of come to diagnose this manic way that Brian Laundrie would act. The world isn't against a Brian Laundrie or the Brian Laundries of the world. The world, or people who are decent, you know, human beings, are against the horrific actions and ways that Brian Laundrie would act out. That's what they're ultimately against. And so, folks, I'm not saying that it isn't important to let off some steam once in a while. You know, I am one of the few that can relate to certain things in that category, for sure. I think it's very important to always get certain things off your chest. There's no question. But when I speak about it, I mean the the manic way that Brian Laundrie was always just angry about everything and going into tirades, and the way that when people would get hurt or in some way discomforted by him, how he would find that funny. And why Brian Laundrie, why is that funny in the first place? It should be very, very serious when we look at the suffering of others, okay, or people who get killed, for example, and things like that. No aspect of that should ever be taken in this kind of lighthearted way or be a funny thing. So, in a way, the way that I look and try to examine Brian Laundrie as best as I can without passing like an official diagnosis on him, I look at the aspects of his borderline personality that drives so much of all the things that he has done. In Brian Laundrie's world, it feels like to me, as I examine this kind of in a true crime angle, that every single thing that happens to Brian Laundrie. It doesn't happen to other people. It doesn't happen to Aunt Rosa down the street. It doesn't happen to Johnny, Jimmy, and Jennifer. It always seems to happen to Brian Laundrie. And so his lack of concern and real feeling for others and the problems that often come into people's lives or hinder their own success in certain ways, and his overemphasis on literally every single aspect of life being about the world against Brian Laundrie is one of the big reasons why I truly desired to do this profile analysis. And there will be more that I would like to go into detail about, but I see things in a very spiritual light. So the borderline obsessive personality that he had is very much in the frame of the borderline personality disorder, but there's something more to it. And that is something I would like to address. There's some way that he felt like every single thing he did was in order to prove something to himself. And I feel like, more and more as I look back on it, that someone like Brian Laundrie, rather than push people away, should have asked and requested for help from others earlier in his life. He was very, very adamant about keeping some of his family and his cousins, and even his parents, ironically enough, out of his life for much of his time in general. And that is ultimately a mistake, because there is a manic side to what was observed with Brian Laundrie. And that is an interesting, walnut to crack, so to speak. And I would want to ask someone who was analyzing his demeanor, what made Brian Laundrie feel like he just had to be lashing out at everybody all the time? What made Brian so obsessed, with kind of this grandiose self that everything that happened is always something happening to Brian Laundrie? And in this way, it's not something that's happening to Gabby. It's not something that's happening to his aunt. It's not happening to Cassie, even, and so forth. It's just, even though it really ultimately may seem just a bit cliche at this point, it's always everything that is happening directly to Brian Laundrie. And so in this way of how I am viewing this diagnosis, it's like no matter what anyone did, there wasn't a real way, because of some of his deep-seated beliefs and issues, for people to get him to understand that there are a lot of other folks out here, that there are a lot of other issues out here, as opposed to just the world of Brian Laundrie. And so the more and more that I kind of peel back the onion, so to speak, I see someone who is very troubled. And in the same way, I wouldn't hesitate to make certain that they are stopped and so forth, no question. But in the way that they are troubled in such a very real form that it almost feels like Brian Laundrie, ever since, he turned 16 years old, has been screaming out for help. And that how important it is that there can be certain people, even professionals in certain types of situations, who can talk to somebody like a Brian Laundrie, who is in that kind of manic state, and reach them to begin to recognize everything about how events have played out is partly due to Brian's own obsession with himself and his lack of regard for the boundaries of most other people. And we see it time and time again with the issues that surround grandiose narcissism and similar untreated habits. But in particular, it actually went much, much further than it normally has in the past when it came to Brian Laundrie in specific, because it's almost as if he couldn't be satisfied by almost any kind of outcome in life unless Brian was the one who was writing all the words on all the pages, or something to that effect. And because of that, he wanted his official stamp on everything, which is just impossible for anybody to ultimately have an outcome like that. But in the world that is more delusional but quite serious of a Brian Laundrie, he ultimately felt entitled or obligated in some way that he would have that affixed to everything and have his fingerprints upon everything. And in this way, it's just more important than ever that people really look very closely at situations like Brian Laundrie, because it's going to teach someone a lot more than they will ever learn from any kind of TV show. And this is why I've greatly enjoyed having this little discussion and fireside chat with you guys. There's more to really analyze and to ponder, to think about why Brian Laundrie did some of the things that he did. And also in such an unfeeling and callous way. Where was his caring for his parents or even his uncle or anyone? It seems very, very clear that in Brian Laundrie's world, no matter what happened, it had to have Brian Laundrie's fingerprints on everything, or else he just wasn't satisfied to live life. And maybe that's something that applies to almost anyone in a similar position. But in specific, I'm going to refer this back to Brian Laundrie directly because, of course, my channel and similar things would not occur the same way they are if it was not for Brian Laundrie's actions and what they caused. And in this way, I greatly thank a Brian Laundrie as such for being out there, because no other way are some things learned in this world. So thank you. There's a little more I'll look at getting into here towards the end. So I just wanted to indicate something very clear to everyone as I redo part of this video, because it was very important. A lot of people like to throw around the word serial killer very liberally, so to speak, and that's not always the case. I mean, a serial killer, when you really think about it, that's someone like, for example, Juan Galarza, or John Freeman Colt, and so on. That does not at all in any sense really describe someone like Brian Laundrie, for example. And it's very strange. A lot of people like to throw around this word so liberally without really flinching or thinking about it. And admittedly, it is odd when you consider the fact that Juan Galarza was a part of several different groups, and then of course using Green Dot is not always a very smart move, so to speak, because Green Dot is kind of a prepaid cash related transaction, supposedly. But I mean, anyone who says Brian Laundrie is like a serial killer, something like that, they don't know what they're talking about. I mean, you got to be very honest. There's a lot of real serial killers that we've seen today, including David Brahm and so on, and they have a very long rap sheet. So he has kind of a bipolar way about him, that's true. And it is very odd that one of these victims, allegedly by the name of Sheridan or something, was found deceased near Myrtle Beach. But I mean, accidentally taking a couple of people out or something doesn't actually make you a serial killer. That's just total nonsense, and I just wanted to point that out. And in the realistic sense, when we look at it, like Kimberly Kessler, that's a serial killer. Juan Galarza, who's murdered more than, 8 people, and I've confirmed it to you guys over and over again on this channel, that's a serial killer. Brian Laundrie, on the other hand, just doesn't fit the MO. But of course, in the state of Maryland, there are some interesting individuals, and Green Dot Cash Cards is kind of an interesting company to go ahead and start being a part of. So I just wanted to point that out. There are bipolar mannerisms about people like Brian Laundrie. They have a lot of interesting aspects to them. The True Crime Show has covered before. They have some very interesting tendencies. But we have to be careful about using the term serial killer. Just like it was, that free money at the bank, so to speak, tossing it around like dollar bills. That's all I was going to point out on that. It's a term that has a lot of emphasis behind it. And when I think about what's gone on in the Wyoming National Park especially, Bethune would almost be considered a little more dangerous at times than a Brian Laundrie, for example. I mean, that person has done some interesting things and had a lot of photography going on in the same park. And then you think about the person who came from Florida State, who clearly should not have been there and has potentially done away with more than a dozen victims. And you just realize this is a term we need to think very, very carefully about. And of course, there's a lot more to explore on this. So thank you. Never forget the story about the serial killer, David Koresh. Very interesting and very timely. Thank you. So, hey, and like I said, folks, I'd like to make sure that I get this video up soon, particularly for you guys, so you can really start to digest some of this. But my overall feeling of it is, I think Brian Laundrie, or at least the archetype of Brian Laundrie and so on, really had a serious bipolar dissociative disorder. And bipolar means he just had this way of going in all directions on certain things. He would just, and I understand as much as anyone else when someone needs to vent, because everyone, I feel, truly does need to have their space to vent. But with the Brian Laundrie archetype and the scenario that he really is, I feel the bipolar diagnosis with dissociative identity as well really sums it up the best. He just had a lot of demonic struggles, and he reminds me a little bit of kind of David Koresh. I don't know if that many of you are familiar with Mr. Koresh, but he had an interesting history with the Branch Davidians apparently, and that's what I wanted to speak on just for a moment here. It was interesting because to this day, the statements that Koresh has made have been used in all these different religious upbringings, and his words were taken completely out of context in a way, because the original words they're based off of in the actual Bible or biblical text, they are not they're not genuine. In other words, the actual biblical text and spiritual text that speaks about those things, because I have a strong belief in God, I can tell you. But anyway, those original texts do not mention anything like David or Isaac having many wives or partners and so forth that are 13 or 14 or 15 or 12 years old. They never mention anything like that, is the interesting part about the whole situation with David Koresh. But they do mention things, about certain rabbi leaders and people doing that against God's will at a certain time in history. I know that. But it doesn't mention anything about, David and so forth doing that on a regular interval, or anyone, in fact, doing that at all. Come to think of it, when reading through the biblical story and really studying it word for word. And so, I caution people just to remember today, especially when we look at a Brian Laundrie type of case, or we try to diagnose that, we want to do so with compassion and understanding of the context. And I can tell you right now, the context is totally wrong when it comes to what they say David did and things like that. He did not do those things in the Bible, that's for sure. In fact, nearly none of them ever had any kind of relationship with a child at all, and thank goodness it did not occur, for sure. But there were disobedient, religious leaders and so forth at that part of Jerusalem that were doing that against God's will. But remember, that was never actually officially a part of David and Isaac. It wasn't a part of any of them. And so when I look at that with Mr. Koresh and similar, I have some compassion there, but I think we need to be able to overall remember and understand that some of these people are bipolar. And I think that Mr. Koresh and similar were certainly in that same wavelength and frame of mind. And so when I look at the history of Brian Laundrie, I have to thank him in some ways, because I wouldn't have gotten to really start excelling into the places where I need to be, okay? But he had definitely just a bipolar way about him. And we need to remember that about some of these interesting leaders that have been out there for a long time. And if you've never heard the story of David Koresh, I think that that's a very valuable story at this time period that we're in, to be able to learn more and learn more of the history of that. And so that helps me to understand and see kind of in a different way the Summer Wells cases as well. But at the same time, it's just wrong and it's incorrect, and that's why I'm able to come out, and say so strongly, don't believe what those preachers and so on were saying about the content that's written in the written word of God and similar, because that actually isn't written in there at all. And it's really context is the key. And context is always the key to everything. That's an important thing to remember, especially when it comes to seeing someone like a Brian Laundrie and understanding where they come from. So thank you again. More to come. I will be reviewing one of the technology tablets at some point here in the near future. That will be a part of kind of the content that I do too. So that'll be fun to do that. Thanks, guys.